My parents skipped my wedding for my sister. What happened next exposed their lies. Hello, read it. There's a moment in every person's life when the truth about their family becomes impossible to ignore. For me, it happened on my wedding day, staring at the two empty chairs reserved for my parents. They weren't running late, nor had they forgotten. They simply weren't coming. And while their absence spoke volumes, the real sting came from what it symbolized. A lifetime of being overshadowed and undervalued, always second to the perfect image they had built around my sister. My name is Adam, and I'm 32 years old. I grew up in what most people would consider an ideal family. My parents were well respected in our community. My childhood home was spacious and immaculately kept, and from the outside looking in, everything seemed picture perfect. But perfection has a price, and in our family, it was one I always seemed to pay. From as early as I can remember, my older sister Emma was the center of our parents' universe. Emma, the golden child, the prodigy, the one whose accomplishments were celebrated as if they were family achievements. Emma was the overachiever who set records in school sports, brought home academic trophies, and eventually carved out a career that aligned perfectly with my parents' vision of success. Me? I was the quiet one, the one with potential, as my father liked to say, though that potential always seemed to fall just short of Emma's accomplishments. I liked to tinker with computers, write short stories, and daydream about traveling the world. My interests weren't flashy, and they certainly didn't give my parents the kind of bragging rights they craved. Growing up, I tried to find my place in the family dynamic, but no matter how hard I worked or what I achieved, it always felt like I was playing catch-up. Emma was the star, and I was the supporting act. When she was accepted into an Ivy League school, my parents hosted a dinner party to celebrate. When I earned a scholarship to a respected state university, my achievement was acknowledged with a quick good job before the conversation inevitably shifted back to Emma. As I got older, I stopped trying to compete. I threw myself into my own life, carving out a path that felt true to me. It wasn't the life my parents had envisioned, but it was mine. I found a career I loved in tech, started my own small business, and built a circle of friends who genuinely supported me. And then I met Katie. Katie was nothing like the people my parents surrounded themselves with. She wasn't obsessed with appearances or status. She was warm, genuine, and completely uninterested in the world of social hierarchies my parents valued so deeply. We met at a conference, bonded over our shared love of hiking and photography, and within months, I knew she was the one I wanted to spend my life with. When Katie and I got engaged, I felt a happiness I hadn't known was possible. But that joy came with a nagging sense of dread. I knew my parents wouldn't approve, not because of Katie herself. She was kind, intelligent, and accomplished in her own right, but because of what our marriage represented. My parents had spent years curating the image of a perfect family, with Emma at the center. My wedding threatened to disrupt that narrative, especially since it was happening before Emma's. Emma's engagement to Patrick, a wealthy attorney from a prestigious family, had been the talk of every family gathering for months. My mother had practically transformed her life into a full-time wedding planner, overseeing every detail with the kind of intensity usually reserved for royal affairs. The venue, the guest list, the designer dress, everything about Emma's wedding was designed to showcase the family's success. When I announced my engagement, the reception was noticeably cooler. My mother smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. My father gave me a stiff pat on the back and asked if we had set a date. The unspoken message was clear. Congratulations, but don't overshadow your sister. Katie and I decided on a small, intimate wedding, something true to who we were. When we sent out the invitations, I included my parents, fully expecting them to come. Despite everything, I believed they would set aside their reservations for one day, that they would show up for me the way they always did for Emma. When the RSVP cards came back, theirs was missing. I called my mother to ask about it, assuming it was an oversight. Her tone was clipped, her words rehearsed as she explained they wouldn't be attending. They were overwhelmed with Emma's wedding preparations and simply didn't have the time. She hoped I would understand. Her words hit me like a blow, and I sat in silence as she rattled off excuses. They weren't just skipping my wedding, they were making it clear where I stood in their hierarchy of priorities. The day of my wedding was beautiful and painful in equal measure. Katie looked radiant, and our closest friends gathered to celebrate us. But every time I glanced at the two empty chairs meant for my parents, a wave of bitterness washed over me. Their absence was a reminder that, to them, appearances and status mattered more than their son's happiness. For months after the wedding, I barely heard from them. When they did call, it was to gush about Emma's wedding plans, the custom floral arrangements, the gourmet menu, the designer invitations. They never asked about Katie or our life together. It was as though my marriage didn't exist. I tried to push it out of my mind, to focus on the life Katie and I were building. But as Emma's wedding day approached, my parents' obsession with perfection reached new heights. Social media posts detailed every step of the planning process, each one a carefully curated glimpse into their perfect family. And then it happened. The cracks began to show. For as long as I could remember, my parents had built their identity around the idea of a flawless family. Their carefully curated image wasn't just for the benefit of friends and neighbors. It was their currency, their way of asserting status in a world that valued appearances above all else. Emma was their crowning achievement, the centerpiece of their narrative. And now, her wedding was supposed to be the pinnacle of it all, the event that cemented their legacy as the perfect parents with the perfect daughter. But perfection is fragile, and when it breaks, it shatters. It started with whispers. A few weeks before Emma's wedding, I overheard snippets of conversations during family calls. My mother sounded more frazzled than usual, her usual chipper tone replaced by sharp edges. My father's attempts to soothe her seemed half-hearted, their words punctuated by long silences. At first, I thought it was just the stress of wedding planning. Emma's event was a spectacle in the making, an outdoor ceremony at an estate, followed by a lavish reception with over 200 guests. My mother was overseeing every detail, from the shade of the napkins to the seating arrangements. But the tension in their voices suggested something deeper, something they weren't ready to share. I didn't ask. After their absence at my wedding, I had learned to keep my distance. Katie noticed it too, the way I tensed up when they called, the brief, hollow conversations that left me feeling drained. She told me I didn't have to pick up, but part of me couldn't let go of the hope that one day, things might change. That hope took another blow when the first scandal hit. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I saw a post that stopped me cold. It was from a distant relative, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, commenting on Emma's engagement. Except it wasn't about how beautiful the wedding would be or how lucky Patrick was to have found her. It was a scathing remark about their relationship, calling it convenient, and questioning whether Patrick even wanted to get married at all. The post was vague but pointed, and it quickly gained traction among family members. Comments poured in, some defending Emma, others echoing the sentiment that Patrick might not be as devoted as he seemed. I sat there, rereading the thread, a strange mix of curiosity and unease settling over me. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Patrick had always seemed like the picture of confidence, handsome, successful, and effortlessly charming. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about him. My interactions with Patrick had been brief and polite, and while he seemed pleasant enough, there was a certain distance in his demeanor. I brushed it off as gossip, but it planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't ignore. A few days later, my parents called. My mother's voice was tense. Her words clipped as she gave me a rapid-fire update on the wedding. The flowers were arriving early, the rehearsal dinner was booked, and Emma's dress had been altered for the final time. She sounded like a general preparing for battle, her tone leaving no room for pleasantries. But then she slipped. In the middle of her monologue, she mentioned a small hiccup with Patrick, quickly brushing it off before I could ask for details. Her dismissal only heightened my curiosity. Something was wrong, and my parents were doing everything in their power to cover it up. I found out what it was 2 days later. Katie and I were having dinner when my phone buzzed with a text from an old high school friend. He was one of the few people I'd kept in touch with from my hometown, and though we didn't talk often, he had an uncanny knack for showing up when something dramatic happened. His message was short but loaded. "Did you hear about Patrick?" My stomach dropped. I replied, asking what he meant, and his response came almost immediately, a screenshot of a local news article. The headline hit me like a punch to the gut. "Local attorney caught in scandal." accusations of workplace misconduct emerge. Patrick's name was front and center. The article detailed allegations from two former employees who claimed Patrick had behaved inappropriately toward them. While the accusations hadn't escalated to legal action yet, the story was spreading fast. His firm had already issued a statement distancing themselves from him, and his reputation was taking a hit. I stared at the screen, unsure of how to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a hiccup. This was a full-blown disaster. And with Emma's wedding just weeks away, it threatened to derail everything my parents had worked so hard to build. I didn't know whether to feel sympathy or vindication. On one hand, Emma's perfect life was crumbling in a way I wouldn't wish on anyone. On the other, a part of me couldn't ignore the bitter satisfaction of seeing the cracks in my parents' facade. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, the family group chat exploded with messages. My mother tried to downplay the situation, insisting the wedding was still on and that Patrick was innocent until proven guilty. Emma stayed silent, her usual confident presence conspicuously absent. Over the next few days, the tension in the family reached a breaking point. My parents went into damage control mode, calling relatives to assure them that the wedding would proceed as planned. But the cracks were too big to ignore. People started asking questions, whispering behind Emma's back, and for the first time, my parents couldn't maintain their grip on the narrative. I watched it all unfold from a distance, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. For years, I had been the outsider, the one whose life was deemed less important. Now, as their golden child's perfect image shattered, they were scrambling to hold on to something they had spent decades building. But this was only the beginning. The cracks in Emma's perfect image were widening, and for the first time, I wasn't the one holding my breath, waiting for approval or validation. I was on the outside, watching the fallout unfold like an intricate house of cards collapsing in slow motion. For years, I had been made to feel like the lesser child, the one who couldn't quite measure up. Now I was watching the pedestal my parents had placed Emma on crumble beneath her feet. In the days following the scandal about Patrick, my parents were in full crisis mode. My mother's calls became frantic updates about damage control. She spoke in clipped, breathless sentences about how they were standing by Emma and not letting this ruin everything. It was obvious they were more concerned about the family's reputation than Emma's feelings. I said little during those calls, letting her ramble while I listened with a mix of detachment and grim amusement. Katie overheard some of the conversations and gave me a knowing look, her lips pressed into a thin line as she held back her thoughts. She didn't need to say anything. We both knew exactly what was happening. Emma, however, was silent. She didn't reach out, didn't post anything on social media, didn't even try to defend Patrick publicly. It was a strange departure from her usual confidence, the carefully composed persona she had spent years cultivating. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. A week after the news broke, my parents announced that the wedding was being postponed. They didn't call it canceled, of course not. That would have been an admission of failure, something they couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge. My mother's voice cracked as she explained how circumstances had forced their hand. The postponement sent shockwaves through the family. Relatives who had already booked flights and accommodations were furious, their frustration spilling into the family group chat. My parents tried to appease them with vague promises about a future date, but the damage was done. The whispers I had seen online about Patrick's misconduct were now making their way through family circles, and the once flawless image my parents had worked so hard to maintain was in tatters. For the first time, they were experiencing what it felt like to be scrutinized, judged, and found wanting. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a flicker of satisfaction. After years of being pushed aside, overlooked, and made to feel like an afterthought, there was something undeniably cathartic about seeing the cracks in their perfect world. But the satisfaction was fleeting, overshadowed by a deeper sense of melancholy. No matter how much my parents' obsession with appearances had hurt me, I couldn't take joy in their unraveling. I wasn't bitter enough for that, at least not entirely. There was still a part of me that wanted them to wake up, to see the damage their priorities had caused, and to finally understand how much they had hurt me. It was around this time that Emma called me. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, the usual edge of confidence replaced by something fragile. She told me she needed to talk, and I agreed to meet her at a cafe halfway between our homes. I wasn't sure what to expect, an apology, an explanation, or perhaps just a venting session, but I was curious enough to find out. When I arrived, Emma was already there, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked different, smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything had physically diminished her. I took a seat across from her, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. She began by admitting that she had known about the allegations against Patrick before they became public. She had convinced herself they weren't true, that they were the result of misunderstandings or jealousy. But as more details surfaced, she couldn't ignore the truth. Patrick had a pattern, one that painted a picture she could no longer deny. Her voice trembled as she described the fallout, how their engagement had unraveled in the span of days, how she had been forced to confront the reality of who Patrick was. She told me about the arguments with our parents, their insistence that she salvage the wedding at all costs to protect the family's image. For the first time, Emma seemed vulnerable, human. I listened, my own emotions tangled. There was a part of me that wanted to comfort her, to offer some reassurance. But another part of me couldn't forget the years of being overshadowed, of watching my parents pour all their energy into her while I faded into the background. When she finally finished, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said something I never expected. She envied me. I stared at her, stunned, as she explained. She envied the freedom I had found with Katie, the life I had built without needing our parents' approval. She admitted that she had spent years trying to live up to their expectations, only to realize too late that their approval came with a cost she was no longer willing to pay. Her words stayed with me long after we parted ways. For so long, I had seen Emma as the golden child, the perfect one who could do no wrong. I had resented her for it, for the way our parents idolized her while treating me like an afterthought. But now, I saw her differently. She wasn't just my sister. She was a person struggling under the weight of expectations that had shaped both our lives in different ways. The fallout from Patrick's scandal continued to ripple through the family. My parents' calls became less frequent, their once proud voices subdued. The invitations to family gatherings stopped coming, replaced by strained updates and half-hearted apologies. For the first time, the perfect family image they had worked so hard to maintain was collapsing, and they didn't know how to rebuild it. I wasn't sure what the future held for my relationship with them, or with Emma. But one thing was clear. The dynamic had shifted. The golden child had fallen, and in her fall, the truth about our family had been laid bare for everyone to see. In the weeks following Emma's confession, I found myself reflecting on the cracks that had always been present in our family. For years, I believed my parents' narrative of perfection, even as I stood outside it. I had thought their obsession with Emma's success was a reflection of her greatness and my inadequacy. But now, as their world unraveled, I realized it was never about Emma or me. It was about them. My parents had spent decades curating their image, projecting the idea of a perfect family to the outside world. Emma's achievements were a convenient foundation for that image, and I had been relegated to a supporting role because I didn't fit their ideal. But now, with Emma's engagement in ruins and the whispers of Patrick's scandal still echoing through the family, the foundation was crumbling. I heard from Emma sporadically after our meeting at the cafe. She was staying with friends, avoiding our parents, and trying to figure out her next steps. She didn't explicitly say it, but I could sense that she was grappling with more than just the fallout from Patrick. For the first time in her life, she was confronting the weight of our parents' expectations and the cracks they had caused in her own identity. Meanwhile, my parents retreated into damage control. My mother's social media, once a constant stream of curated posts about Emma's accomplishments, went silent. Family friends who had been invited to the wedding were left in the dark, their inquiries met with vague excuses about unexpected delays. The strain was evident in every interaction I had with my parents, their voices tense and clipped as they tried to pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. It wasn't just Patrick's scandal or the postponed wedding. It was the realization that the narrative they had built around Emma wasn't sustainable. Without the engagement to prop it up, the cracks in their perfect image were too big to ignore. Katie saw it too. She didn't say much about the situation, but her quiet support meant everything. One night, as we sat on the couch with a movie playing in the background, she turned to me and said something I hadn't fully considered. Maybe this is what needed to happen for them to finally see things clearly. Her words stayed with me. Could this collapse of their perfect image be the wake-up call they needed? For so long, I had believed they would never change, that their obsession with appearances would always come first. But now, for the first time, I saw the possibility of something different. That possibility came into focus during a phone call with my father. He rarely called me, usually leaving the updates to my mother. So when his name appeared on my screen, I hesitated before answering. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the confidence and authority I had always associated with him. He started by asking how I was, a question that caught me off guard. It wasn't the perfunctory "how are you" that preceded a conversation about Emma or the family. It was genuine. He asked about Katie, about our home, about my work. For the first time in years, it felt like he was interested in me, not as an accessory to the family image, but as his son. Then, slowly and haltingly, he admitted that things hadn't been easy. He talked about the pressure my mother was under, the tension between her and Emma, and the difficulty of watching everything they had built fall apart. He didn't explicitly apologize, but his tone carried an unspoken acknowledgement of the hurt they had caused. The conversation left me conflicted. On one hand, it was the closest thing to validation I had ever received from my father. On the other, it felt like too little, too late. Years of neglect and favoritism couldn't be undone with one conversation, no matter how genuine it seemed. A few days later, Emma called me again. This time, her tone was lighter, more resolved. She told me she had decided to move to another city, to take some time away from the family and figure out what she wanted for herself. She didn't explicitly say it, but I could sense she was stepping out of the role our parents had forced her into. It was a bold move, and I admired her for it. For so long, I had resented Emma for being the center of our parents' world, for overshadowing me in ways that felt impossible to overcome. But now I saw her differently. She wasn't the golden child or the favorite. She was someone who had been shaped by the same pressures I had, albeit in a different way. As Emma distanced herself from our parents, I found myself doing the same, but in a different way. I wasn't cutting ties completely. I didn't feel the need to, but I was setting boundaries for the first time. I stopped answering calls when I didn't feel like it, stopped bending over backward to meet their expectations. Katie was my anchor through it all. She reminded me of what mattered. Our life together, the happiness we had built outside of the family drama. With her support, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The final crack in the family facade came during a family gathering a few weeks later. My parents, desperate to salvage some semblance of normalcy, had invited a small group of relatives over for dinner. It was supposed to be a chance to reconnect, but the tension was palpable from the moment I walked in. My mother spent most of the evening trying to steer the conversation away from Patrick's scandal, her voice brittle as she forced a smile. My father was quieter, his usual commanding presence diminished. Emma wasn't there, her absence a silent reminder of how much had changed. At one point, an aunt leaned over and asked me how married life was treating me. Her question caught me off guard, not because it was unusual, but because it was the first time anyone in the family had acknowledged my marriage without comparing it to Emma's engagement. For the first time, I felt like I was being seen, not as Emma's brother or an accessory to my parents' image, but as myself. As the evening wore on, I realized something. The image my parents had worked so hard to build was gone, and with it, the power it had held over me. Their approval, once so desperately sought, no longer mattered. I left that night feeling lighter than I had in years. The family dinner marked a turning point, not just for my parents, but for me. For years, I had carried the weight of their indifference, the sting of being overshadowed by Emma, and the gnawing insecurity that I might never be enough for them. But sitting at that dinner, seeing the cracks in their carefully curated facade, I realized something that had eluded me for decades. Their obsession with perfection wasn't about me or Emma at all. It was about them, what they wanted to project to the world, and what they needed to believe about themselves. For so long, I had let their version of success define my worth. I let myself believe that because I didn't fit into their narrow idea of a perfect son, I was somehow less valuable. But now, seeing their world unravel, I understood the truth. Their expectations had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with their own insecurities. The weeks that followed that dinner were strangely quiet. Emma was still distant, rebuilding her life in the city she'd moved to, and my parents seemed hesitant to reach out. I assumed they were licking their wounds, retreating into their bubble while they figured out how to salvage the remnants of their image. I didn't mind. The space gave me room to reflect, to process everything that had happened and what it meant for my future relationship with them. Then, one afternoon, my father called. It wasn't the kind of perfunctory check-in I was used to. His tone was different, quieter, more measured. He started by asking how Katie and I were doing, his voice softening when I mentioned a recent trip we'd taken. He asked about my work, his curiosity genuine instead of performative. And then, almost as an afterthought, he apologized. It wasn't dramatic or tearful. It wasn't the kind of apology you see in movies where decades of pain are resolved in a single heartfelt moment. It was awkward and halting, but it was real. He admitted that he and my mother had been unfair to me, that they had put too much emphasis on appearances and not enough on what mattered. He said they were proud of the life I'd built, even if they hadn't always shown it. I sat in stunned silence as his words sank in. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind him of every slight, every time they had ignored my achievements or prioritized Emma's happiness over mine. But another part of me, the part that had spent years craving this acknowledgement, felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The conversation ended with a simple goodbye, but it left me reeling. For the first time, I felt like my parents were starting to see me as more than an afterthought. A week later, my mother called. Her voice was softer than I remembered, lacking the brittle edge that had defined so many of our interactions. She didn't bring up Emma or the postponed wedding. Instead, she asked about Katie, about the house, about me. She told me she missed us, that she wanted to see us more. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. Katie noticed the change, too. When I told her about the conversations, she nodded, her expression thoughtful. Later that evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she told me she was proud of me, not for forgiving my parents outright, but for allowing myself to heal. Meanwhile, Emma was navigating her own journey. We spoke occasionally, her calls becoming less fraught as she settled into her new life. She told me about her new job, the friends she was making, and the small apartment she had furnished with secondhand finds. It wasn't the grand life she'd once envisioned, but she sounded lighter, freer. For the first time, she wasn't trying to live up to anyone's expectations. One evening, she called me out of the blue. Her voice was hesitant as she thanked me for meeting her at the cafe weeks earlier. She admitted that she had always envied my independence, the way I had built a life without needing our parents' approval. She told me she was trying to do the same now, to figure out who she was outside of the role they had assigned her. Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. For so long, I had resented Emma for being the center of our parents' world, for overshadowing me at every turn. But now, I saw her as someone who had been trapped in her own way, burdened by the same impossible standards I had spent my life rejecting. My parents, too, were changing in their own way. Their calls became more frequent, their questions more thoughtful. They even made an effort to include Katie in conversations, asking her about her work and interests instead of treating her as an accessory to my life. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, still remnants of their old habits. But it was progress. The final shift came during a visit to their house a few months later. Katie and I had been invited for dinner, and though I was hesitant at first, I agreed to go. The evening was quieter than I expected, the conversation more subdued. My parents seemed less concerned with impressing us, and more focused on simply spending time together. At one point, my father walked me into his study. The room was filled with the usual trappings of his life. Bookshelves lined with biographies, framed photos of Emma's accomplishments. But on one shelf, tucked between a stack of awards, was something new, a framed photo from my wedding. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it spoke volumes. For the first time, my life was being acknowledged as part of the family story. As Katie and I drove home that night, I felt a strange sense of closure. My parents' perfect family image was gone, replaced by something messy, something more human. It wasn't the picture-perfect resolution I might have dreamed of as a child, but it was real. And for the first time, I felt like I had reclaimed my place. Not as an afterthought, but as someone who mattered.